Hi everybody, welcome to my presentation about being haunted by the letter U. I'm Robert Stewart. I was born in Ontario, Canada, and moved down to the States when I was quite young. Luckily for me, both languages speak English as their primary language. Although that flag of Canada doesn't really tell you the full story, I think this flag is a much better representation of the kind of language that's spoken because, as you can see in the corner, we speak the Queen's English in Canada. So even though today we currently use this flag, we're still technically part of the British Commonwealth, along with a lot of other countries in which the UK still has some influence over. But it's not that simple. Hold your horses, because Canada also speaks French. In fact, large parts of it, Quebec mostly, was formerly a French colony, and still the second primary language of Canada is French. So you get a lot of influence from that, not just from having the two languages, but into the English as well. You get a sort of a mongrelization occurring. So what does that mean exactly? Well, as many people know, if you've used a computer in multiple different countries, they have different keyboard settings depending on where you go. And if you go to the UK or parts of the old Commonwealth, you'll notice that they have the keyboard set to UK English. And all that really does is change the spelling of certain words that you're going to type out, and it will mark them as wrong if you spell them in the quote-unquote American way, and correct, and vice versa for the UK and American keyboards. Now let's go over some examples of words like these. Just to begin this examination, I think it's important to ask the question of why. Why would you drop a simple one letter out of a word? It doesn't change it all that much. We all still pretty much pronounce it and say the same things, and we'll get into a difference between pronunciations between Canadian English and American English a little later. But just a simple question, why? What was the purpose of dropping this U? Now, obviously, the last slide was something of a joke. There isn't a conscious or active effort to kick French out of the English language or kick French influence out of the English language, but it does hold some truth in the fact that over time you have seen the progression, especially in American modern English, of dropping the more foreign or non-native sounds from the English language that we borrowed from French when we borrowed a lot of words back in the, 12th, 13th, 14th century going on into Middle English, when these languages were so in contact in England and on the continent of Europe, that those aren't sounds we make anymore. So even though it's spelt with the traditional French ending, if you were to read that in French, you know that you say it armure, calor, but we don't make that sound in English, that U at the end with the O-U-R. So even in the UK version of the spelling, it's still just pronounced color, as you would in America. So only the spelling really stayed. So it makes sense that if you're not going to pronounce the letter, to phase it out over time rather than leave it there as a silent U, which once again isn't a very often seen thing in the English language, to just leave a bunch of consonants in there that you're not going to pronounce, especially in modern English. So to put it simply, we've got three different colors: UK, American, and French. Color, and couleur. And you have the pronunciations of the two right there. The UK, US version is on the left, French on the right. So there you have the UK spelling pronounced in this way, similar to the US spelling pronounced the exact same way, so the pronunciation does not change. Where the French version, with all of its funky U's thrown in there, has this different pronunciation of, for example, that first pronunciation, the U sound that we don't really make in English. Now, as was mentioned earlier, you find some, as I put it, mongrelization of English and French together because you have a large population of French Canadians who speak both languages as a native language, and so they have a tendency to maybe stretch out the word, especially the end of that word, color, to make that last O-U-R sound something more like what they would be used to in speaking in French as far as pronunciation and accent goes. And so you find that in Canada, where the spelling makes a little more sense just because of the close connection that they have to the French community with English, all tied into one place. But for the majority of people there who don't, not everyone speaks French up in Canada. So the majority of people who don't, they're just English speaking. They will pronounce it the exact same way as an American would. Just the spelling's different, and it has caused me endless nonsense and confusion throughout my academic life. Now, before continuing on, let's try to go over some more spelling differences, like favorite and favorite, honor and honor, and you have flavor and flavor. Now, obviously, you can tell with all three of these examples that they use that OUR within the word, and that U is dropped when you move on to the American version. There's countless examples of this, but these are just some. And then finally, we have realize and realize, obviously spelled with a Z in the US version rather than an S, which is a pretty common substitution you see from UK English to American English. And obviously, I grew up learning the S, so it's another thing that I am constantly messing up in my writing and having to go back and recorrect in Word. Now for a sort of funnier example. What is this metal? If you said aluminium, then you actually don't agree with me, because in Canada we say aluminum, much like the Americans do. And while there is a spelling change, I find the pronunciation change to be much more profound and interesting. Because as you can see here, aluminum, which is on the top, is the American and Canadian spelling, and it's pronounced pretty much as it's spelled. The U is an sound at the end, whereas in the British and rest of the world spelling of aluminium is how they pronounce it. They have the IUM, which makes much more of a hiked im sound, which you find on all other sorts of elements like uranium and thorium and francium, and we pronounce all those with the eum. But for some reason along the way, the North American spelling and pronunciation of it changed to get rid of that final eum sound, that I at the end, and it all banks on the U and how you pronounce the U, obviously in tandem with the I along with it. But I just found that to be another interesting example, and one that I find is a bit of a battleground word over what people prefer to be like the correct spelling of it. Obviously, they're both correct in their own right. But if you had to ask me, I actually would prefer the rest of the world spelling of it, just because it's more in line with what we call other elements and how we pronounce other parts of the periodic table. And just for contingency's sake, I think that would be the preferred way to do it. So how does this all fit into history of English language? How does it fit into that context? Well, for me, at least personally, I just find that it's a very interesting look into how somewhat of a modern example of how the transition from Middle English to early modern English could have taken place back in the day as the two languages, French and English, further separated themselves and became more distinct, starting with how words were pronounced and how they were spoken orally, and that transitioning into grammatical rules and how they became spelled in English, depending on the different pronunciations and how those words became about. And as the process of early modern English transitions out of Middle English can be observed through the use of things like loan words and those sort of things making their way into standard English, the same action can be seen taking place with American English, quote unquote, as it transitions further and further away from modern UK English, in much the same process as we saw undertaken before. This time, however, it seems a little more nuanced and less necessary almost for the language to function as a form of communication, because it all still means and sounds the same. Really, it's only the spelling changes, and those are, like I said, pretty unnecessary. Well, at the same time, as much as I love and hate grammar, I think it's a very fascinating look into how the language change over time and how they develop, and how the processes that we've studied during the semester, from the transitions from old to early to middle, all these steps of the English language, how they kind of came about and how that process continues to go forward as we further separate our languages, even though they're both still English. It's funny enough to see that in transitioning away from UK English, we're not kicking English parts out of the language, we're kicking more French parts out of the language, just as they did before, in more dramatic ways. So I just found that, at least in my life, has always sort of had some effect on how I write, this sort of process of these, vowel sounds and these French influences further leaving from the UK English, and it messes with the way I write, and I've constantly had to go back and redo and rewrite things. I've had teachers mark them wrong. I've worked at jobs overseas where they wanted me to type in the UK version, and I, had just gotten used to spelling things the American way and had to flip-flop, and it's always been confusing. So I hope this was somewhat as fascinating as it is for me. I know I threw a lot of examples at the wall and just sort of focused on the U, because for some reason it's been this specter for me my entire academic career. But yeah, thank you very much. Have a good one.